Welcome back, and thanks for joining our first event of the year. So we are so honored to invite Dr. Cherise Sedberry to give us a talk on a topic from personal struggles to professional strength in a diverse world. And I will give you just a brief introduction of Dr. Dr. Sedberry, but we have her full description of her CV on the invitation. So you guys please go back to find the detailed bio for Dr. Sedberry. Dr. Sedberry received her doctoral and master's degree in counseling psychology with the emphasis in sports psychology from University of Missouri and Columbia. And she is a Ronald McNair Fellow. She's joining our faculty as an adjunct professor this semester. So we are so honored to have her to be on our faculty, and she's also she's a licensed counseling psychologist with an area of specialization in eating disorder, depression, anxiety, and trauma. She is also working as a sports psychologist for many years. She's been a preferred provider for a lot of sports associations and organizations. And previously, she has some experience with Florida, right? Although she's probably not from here, she worked at the University of Florida and Florida State University counseling centers with extensive experiences working with diverse populations. So without further ado, I'm going to turn my floor to Dr. Sedberry.
All right. Hi, I am Dr. Cherise Sedberry. Thank you, Chief, for introducing me. Kind of just going to go through my background story, my history, what my life growing up has been like, and how that influenced me and kind of where I'm at professionally. Probably smaller portion of the discussion. And then I'll leave some time for questions at the end, which I'm assuming, Betsy, you'll have to kind of probably navigate all of that to make that work. So I'm going to show you a quick picture, if I can pull it up. So this is the 18-year-old me. This was actually on our 18-year-old high school road trip to Montreal for graduation. I think I went with like 3 or 4 of my friends. We took the bus up there. There is a lot going on with this young lady that you see there, but we'll stick to the topic at hand, and at hand the topic is diversity. Of course, we could talk about diversity for days and about different aspects of that, you know, in terms of religion, gender, sex, nationality, socioeconomic status, but I'm going to focus a lot more on racial, ethnic diversity and understanding that culture. And there's one thing I want to lead in with is that it is a privilege to learn about racism rather than experience your whole life. And so what I'm going to talk a lot about is that experience of racism and what that's looked like and how that's developed and changed as I've gotten older. So when I was growing up, am I still sharing my screen?
Yes.
How do I unshare?
Okay.
Oh, I see it. Never mind. I got it. There we go. So I grew up in Massachusetts, a town called Easton, Massachusetts, not, you know, like the bat, but we made shovels. Town was about 23,000 people. But if you know anything about Massachusetts, this is itty bitty state. So there's 7 million people in Massachusetts. So even though my town was small, it didn't feel small because there's so many people in the state. Just to give you a little bit of a background of my town, we have one of the, according to Wikipedia, the oldest and most illustrious U.S. families that founded that town in the Ames family. Congressmen, railroad, industries, and of course there's scandals that go with that as well. And then there was a really big, prominent architect that designed a lot of the buildings in my town, and this becomes relevant later in the story, but his name was H.H. Richardson, and so we'll get back to him at a different point in time. But to give you an idea, Easton, Massachusetts is 91% white, 1.5% African American, and then there's some sprinklings of other racial and ethnic minorities in that grouping. And part of that, I bring that up because even though it was a predominantly white town, Massachusetts is very culturally rich. So growing up, white people weren't white for me. They were Irish, they were Italian, Portuguese, and then beyond that, there's Brazilians and Cape Verdeans and all of these different enclaves that existed. So growing up, I didn't grow up in the sense of that I was other or different, because there was so much culture. Being a racial and ethnic minority didn't really stand out. It wasn't salient for me as I was growing up. And some of that also played into the fact that on one side of my house growing up, my neighbor family was an Irish family, Irish immigrant family that actually grew up in the same projects as my mom. So if you know anything about the Irish and their immigration to the US, they came and became kind of like the lowest of the rung of immigrants that came here. And so they were forced to live in and compete for jobs with African Americans and living in those projects. So there's a lot of that historical racial issue in the south end of Boston, which is a pretty predominant Irish community because of that. But then there's also a lot of camaraderie because they grew up in that same area and with the same struggles. There's a lot of connection between the Irish and the African Americans. So that family actually grew up in the same neighborhood as my mom, and they were like a second family. And then on the other side, we had my Italian family, and they were, again, another second family. So there was just a lot of culture that I was infused with, but there's a lot of mixed messages in terms of what I experienced growing up. And some of that was the fact that Massachusetts was one of the first free states, free slave states. So there was a huge influx of African Americans from the South that came into Massachusetts, including both sides of my family's, my grandparents from both sides, except for my paternal grandmother. My maternal side is from the Tennessee area, and my paternal side is from the Mississippi area. We also grew up going to Plymouth Plantation. I don't know if any of you guys know anything about Plymouth Plantation, but I'm sure you've heard of Plymouth Rock. And so there's a rock that's not actually where the ships landed, but they say that's the rock. And when we're growing up in elementary school, we go to Plymouth Plantation and we see how the Native Americans lived and how the Pilgrims lived. And so there's that glorified story around that we were infused with when we're growing up. But at the same time, there's still a really rich Native American culture in Massachusetts. And so there's always the protest on Columbus Day. So there's these mixed messages. This is a free state. There's a lot of cultural, there's a lot of different cultures here. But there's also an understanding of that there's a history and a reason why this was a free state. There's a history and there's a reason why these protests are happening. And then there were some, splatterings of things that may have been more overt racism in the sense of the Charles Stewart case in 1989. Now, I was only 8 years old when that happened, but my father being my father, would have those discussions about it. But if you're not familiar with the Charles Stewart case, a guy claimed that a Black man came in and shot his pregnant wife. And so the state, basically Boston City police rounded up every Black man that they could and interrogated them to see who it was. Come to find out the guy killed his own wife and lied about it. And so there's these mixed messages of understanding that there's this cultural infusion that's happening, but at the same time, there's underpinnings of that racism still exists. Within my home, my father was of mixed background. So my grandfather was also of mixed background. I don't know exactly the lineage, if it was his father or the father before that was a plantation owner and had a child with a slave. But my grandfather was mixed, and he was an army, served in the army in World War II, and met my grandmother, who was a French immigrant. So when she came here, she did not speak English. Blonde hair, blue eyes. So you have a Black man married to a white woman in the 40s, 50s era, where that's illegal in a lot of states. So my grandfather experienced a lot of racism, a lot of being stopped by the police and being asked what he's doing with this white woman. So these are the stories my father would tell me growing up. My father also marched in the civil rights movement, and he was very adamant in telling me and detailing that history. He was about 16, I think, during that time. And my father could pass. My father had, at the time, strawberry blonde hair. He has blue eyes. He's very fair skinned. And so for him, he's always identified as being Black, though. And he really drilled that in. We fought and died for you to have opportunities. And so understanding my history as a person of color was really important for him. My mother's side of the family is African American and Native American. And if you don't know anything about, what happened with Black Indians back then, at the time when the US was trying to create all these treaties, which I'm going to air quote because we know what that really looks like, with the Native American population, in order for them to protect the treaty, and through this blood quantum, which I'm going to air quote again because that was a fictitious thing that doesn't actually exist, but through this blood quantum process, that they had to strengthen the tribe. And to strengthen the tribe, they kind of kicked out people who didn't fully represent what would equate to the blood quantum quotients that they were looking for. So those who were Black Indian were kicked out of the tribes. So I don't have any tribal affiliation as a result of that. But that is what I grew up understanding, is that portions of my family were from the Black Indians that were kicked out of those tribes. Now, the other part of this, though, that my father always drilled home to me is that you treat people with the golden rule. You treat people with respect. So even though my dad could see a racist America, and he chose to bring us up in a predominantly white area, not necessarily to choose to bring us up in a predominantly white area, but he chose to move us out of the projects and the inner cities and raise his family in that area to give them better opportunity. And he could see that there was a divide in terms of the opportunities we would be given if we continued to live in Boston versus growing up where we did. He also really drilled in that you don't treat people differently based off of that, because he understood that fundamentally it was wrong, right? So I'm going to fight for our rights, and I understand there are people that are pulling us back, but at the end of the day, you still don't treat people differently because of that factor. But within everything in my life, there's always a mixed message. So he was not happy about my brothers dating white girls. And for him, he saw it as very dangerous for a Black man to be with a white woman, because he felt like if anything happened and she said anything negative against him, that the racist undertonings would come out. And so although he was very welcoming and very accepting and very polite and respectful, he didn't really, and he never would say overtly, I don't support this relationship. He would never do that, but he would prefer that my brothers wouldn't put themselves in those situations. So that was kind of the context of what I grew up within the home. So like I said, there's this mixed message in terms of Massachusetts in its history, and then there's mixed message in terms of my home life. And then in the community, I didn't really understand where I stood, or didn't really think of myself as a racial being until I was in junior high or high school. At that point, I started to see that I stood out simply because I was brown. Like I said, everybody had their own cultural background. So it wasn't like, oh, well, you're Black and you're not white. It was never like that, because everybody identified with their culture. But it was just because my skin was a different color than theirs. And then at that time, you also had Janet Jackson, and she's shaving her nose down, and there's this push for these more Eurocentric features, right? And so not that I ever really wanted to be that way, but there's that message in your head, no matter how much we try to fight them. At the time, there was that message of like, ooh, if I got my nose broken in a basketball game, maybe they could adjust it and thin it out like Janet Jackson's. Not really understanding why I thought that way. I would say that although my father was really good at educating me, there were some parts of that education process that we didn't go into and we didn't talk about, because that was just not at his level. When you're fighting for equality, there's not as much of that higher level thinking of internalized racist cues, right? He wasn't thinking about those things. At the same time, you know, that's when I started to realize that I had a relaxer in my hair and nobody else did. Like nobody else had to go through this process of burning their scalp in order to get their hair to be straight. And I also started to realize it was limiting me. Like I couldn't just go swimming, right? And so like seeing that, I stood out because of that. And then there were the comments that started, right? And being the natural athlete, because I was athletic, being a person of color, you were assumed to be naturally athletic, naturally gifted, or people actually trying to start and touch my hair and question about my hair, or the comments about I don't date people of color because you know, I don't have jungle fever, right? And so now you start to hear those things. And at that time was the first indication of very true overt racism that I started to experience, mostly and primarily because of the neo-Nazi movement. That was when the neo-Nazi movement started to take over in Massachusetts, and we saw a lot more people who wanted to be skinheads, and not just with racist theology, but also the anti-Semitic beliefs that were starting to come out. So despite all of that and all of these mixed messages, I think the one thing that stood true and has always stood true in terms of who I am as a person is that I try to still be friends with everyone, right? So I still had a lot of different groups of people that I spent time with. And in some ways, it might have blinded me to maybe how they really felt about me, because I really only spent time with people that I enjoyed interacting with. So if there were people who had negative racist views about me, I didn't know that, because one, it wasn't as salient for me, and two, I spent time with people that I enjoyed spending time with. But I also felt like there was some sort of a protective factor, right? And that golden rule contributed to that. There was an instance where I was pulled over, I think it was 17. Granted, it was like 11:30, 12 o'clock at night. I got pulled over by a police officer miles after I'd already left my friend's house, and I hadn't done anything wrong. And he stopped me, and his line of questioning made me question some of the things that my father had prepared me for, of that you will get pulled over for driving while black, especially in a predominantly white, affluent town. And so the police officers questioned me like, did you steal mulch? Because the person's house that I had left, their father was a mulcher. And I knew immediately, like, I didn't have to answer those questions. And I was like, why would you ask me something like that, and what have you? And he eventually let me go. But at the time, the police chief was, he would do security at the supermarket that I worked at, because he was close to retirement and he was bored. And so I told him what happened, and he immediately said, the next time that happens, this is what you need to do. He's very upset that one of his officers treated me that way. And he said, you need to always get their name and their badge number. You need to let them know that the only thing you're responsible to answering them is providing your license. You don't have to tell them where you're going, where you're coming from, any of that. And you can always ask for a supervisor. And for me, being able to have that relationship with people who didn't necessarily look like me, because this was a white police chief, I knew that not everybody was against me. So it provided kind of a foundation of how I've interacted with people throughout my life. So I go away for school. I go to the University of Nebraska. As I was leaving and preparing to leave, someone from my school was like, why are you going to Nebraska? And I was like, I don't know. And then I got there and I was like, why did I come to Nebraska, right? You don't know that the rest, at 18, I didn't know that the rest of the country didn't look like Massachusetts. I thought there was millions of people everywhere, and that we were going to have, it was just going to be like being in Massachusetts. It was going to be the same thing. I also feel like I got bamboozled. So when I did my visit, I went, and it was an African-American student that showed me around. But then when I got there, I was like, well, where'd all the black people go? So would you all just found the one person to show me around the campus, but I don't see anybody else that looks like me. And I will say this about Nebraska, that despite being termed as one of the friendliest places in our country, and it is a refugee city, so there is a lot of people from different backgrounds there. Like they even have Arabic on the schools because it's a huge Sudanese refugee landing place. It is probably one of the most overt experiences of racism that I had ever in my life up to that point had experienced. And this was my awakening. This is when I started to realize that some of those subtle things I experienced in Massachusetts not only were just subtle, but that there were people who would be overtly that way. And so some of the examples of that were that, you know, I had friends who were from small towns in Nebraska who would say, like, there's no people of color, like, or the only person of color is my cousin who was adopted, who's Black. The only exposure we get to Black people is maybe through BET, if BET is even a channel that was offered in their city, which BET isn't necessarily always the best representation of what Black people look like in this country. I had a coworker who would express a lot of biased views to me. In his mind, it wasn't Spanish, it was Mexican, because all that existed was whites, Blacks, and Mexicans, that there was no other ethnicity out there. And when I challenged him on that, I was told I was opinionated by my supervisor. There was that sense of color blindness, like I don't see color, you know, and realizing when I started to hear that a lot, I started to realize they don't see color because they themselves are not a cultural being. Remember growing up in Massachusetts, the white people I interacted with were of different cultural backgrounds, Italian, Irish, German, Portuguese, Brazilian. When I got to Nebraska, I would ask people like, you know, what ethnicity are you? And they'd say American. I'm like, but that's not a culture. Like, that's not telling me anything. So the idea of colorblindness came from that melting pot mentality. I got asked a lot, are you an athlete? That was the first question anybody would ask me, as if the only reason why I would go to college at Nebraska or would get into college was because I was an athlete. My freshman year, I had a professor who didn't pass me for class. I took a class intentionally pass, no pass, because I don't like history. But I knew going into the final that I had, you know, I had a B in the class, and the only way I wouldn't pass the class is if I absolutely failed the final. And I got my report card back and I didn't pass. And I went and I asked the professor, like, how did I not pass? I want to see my final. Like, what did I do? And he hands me my final and he never graded it. And he just basically said, I'm not going to pass you. And I said, well, you can't do that. Now, granted, on top of being a racial and ethnic minority, I was also a first generation college student. So I had no idea what to do at that point. But I ended up having to retake that class despite some fight that I put up with the ombudsman tried to help me the following semester, but that was to no avail. So at that point, I think experiencing so much overt division, I tried to build better relationships with people of color on campus, unknowing that I was going to then run into colorism. And that's something that we as a community don't talk a lot about, but I was treated very differently based off of assumptions because I was lighter skinned. I was treated very differently based off of assumptions because I wasn't from the South and I wasn't from the Texas area, of what it meant to be from Massachusetts and be a person of color. That there aren't any people of color in Massachusetts, what they would say. And my argument was that we were one of the first free states. So there's a lot of people of color that live in Massachusetts. So I had a lot coming at me at that time. And so this is when I really got into that angry phase of our development as cultural beings. But I still maintained a diverse group of people. That value that my father instilled in me of that you treat people with respect, you give them the benefit of the doubt, you don't look at what they represent in terms of gender or sex or nationality or race, that you see if you treat people with respect and if they respect you back, then those are good people. So I really stood home with that. Now, the crazy thing, and I can sum up my experience in Nebraska, and I have a picture I was going to show you just to give you an idea of this as I told you this. So hold on, let me pull that up.
Sorry, Dr. Sudbury, can I just have a quick announcement?
Yeah.
Before you go ahead, because we are facing some difficulties, so we want to invite all the participants. If you are listening and you cannot chat, please send me an email so we know who you are and we will add you to the chat. Thank you. And sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Let me see if I can get this picture pulled up. Okay. Oops. So if I could sum up my experience in Nebraska with one statement. So this is a couple of my friends and I tailgating, getting ready for football games, because Nebraska's football program at the time, they're not this good anymore, but at the time was coming off back-to-back national championships, was always a contender. So, you know, if you're a football fan, you know where Alabama is now, that Nebraska used to be that. And so that's what Nebraska was like when I was there. On game day Saturday, the football stadium is the third largest city in the state, to give you an idea of what this feels like in this vacuum that I lived in. But anyway, so my friend here that's on the right in the top picture and with me in the bottom picture, her name is Star. Now she is Polynesian descent, so I met a lot of Polynesians when I was in Nebraska. Like I said, I hung out with a diverse group of people. I never shied against culture. So anyway, so I went to Star's family's house for a pregame. Now, mind you, Star's stepfather is white. Her mom is Polynesian, and she's always told me that her father's family was very racist, and that although they are accepting of Asian culture, they are not accepting of African Americans. So like, she would never be able to date a black guy if she ever wanted to, or what have you. So I go to her family's for pregame for a football game that is played by predominantly Black athletes, right? And as we're getting ready to leave, one of her aunts says, "Oh, Tita, why do you have a Confederate flag in your room?" And mind you, she didn't have a Confederate flag in her room. It was the Hawaiian flag, which looks nothing like a Confederate flag. But I knew she was trying to make me understand that I was not welcome. On our way out, she had made a comment of, "Let's make sure all the silver is still here before we leave," right? So if I were to sum up the definition of my experience in Nebraska, it is that sense of that it is okay for us to watch and to cheer on these Black athletes, but it is not okay for you to eat dinner at my home. So where I was blinded before to the racial experiences that were going on, I definitely, in my 4 years of being in Nebraska, was awakened to what the rest of the world looked like and what was really happening in our country. But I will also say there are positives in that, because like I said, I never shied away from people, and there were people, and I'm on a predominantly white campus. So the people that I worked with in the psych department, which was all white, I think we might have had one ethnic minority, but I don't think that there were any African American staff, but they still supported me. So they would point me in the directions of where I could get enhancements as a person of color, like the McNair program. I would have never known about the McNair program if these faculty didn't see me as someone that they wanted to support and push me in that direction. They also were the people who pushed me into the direction of going into psychology, but introduced me to one of my mentors who worked in the athletic department. And so there was a lot of, despite the overt racism I was experiencing, there was a lot of support I was getting at the same time. So as I was graduating, I really didn't want to go to Missouri. I really wanted to go somewhere that I was not going to experience any of this anymore. And instead, I ended up at Mizzou. Now, granted, there were things about Missouri that were attractive. There were Black faculty, right? So now that I'm in my anger, I'm in my development of my racial being, I was able to be in a situation where there were more Black faculty and I could get support around looking at Black athletes and studying Black athletes. And there also was a multicultural focus in the program. So there were certain classes that were designed for multicultural competency training as a professional, and you could get a certificate in that. But I was experiencing a lot of racial burnout. I was experiencing a lot of racial trauma. And it didn't stop. Going to Mizzou, it just all continued. All those same comments, all those same experiences. So by my 4th year, that summer I went and I said, I need to take a break. So I went to Atlanta. And I don't even know why I chose Atlanta, but I just decided I was going to go to Atlanta. And I spent the summer in Atlanta. And for the first time, I felt really empowered coming out of all of that racial burnout, because Atlanta is a predominantly Black city. I got to work at, I got to teach a couple classes at one of the colleges there, one of the HBCUs there. I had a lot of Black people who just supported me, who were like, you're in grad school, like, that's awesome, that's amazing. Instead of questioning how I got there, instead of questioning if I was qualified to be there, if I only got in because I was Black, but being able to feel like people supported me. And so I went back to campus after that summer, and, you know, the idea and the fact that every place I parked, there were Confederate flags on pickup trucks, and cotton was being thrown at the Black Culture Center, and the N-word was being spray painted. And I finally said to my faculty, I said, you know what, I only have a couple classes left, couple things I got to finish, and then I'm on internship and I got to do my dissertation. Can I just find a way for us to work through this so that I don't have to be here? I don't have to be in Missouri to do this. And despite the fact that there were some Black faculty on our staff and that we did this multicultural seminar, my faculty came back to me and said, is it that bad? Is it really that bad? So I fortunately had a faculty member who took my side and fought with me, and that's a whole other story we won't get into and how all that turned out. But I eventually got to be able to go to Atlanta for the spring and the summer semester, but I was required to come back. And then eventually I was able to go on internship. And so I just got the hell out of there as soon as I could. I needed a break. And this is when self-care really became important and was really emphasized to me, is how do you take care of yourself? How do you navigate not just racial burnout, but everything else that I was experiencing? And so being able to go to Atlanta was really important for me. And then going to the University of Florida was an amazing experience, because it is a very diverse, aware university, and they do a lot to establish and support their minority students. And so I had a really good, refreshing time and experience as a result. Then I went to Florida State. Now, granted, I thought that was going to be like Florida, but that wasn't Florida. And so after Florida State, I was like, at this point, you know, if I go back to Kansas and work at the university, it won't be that bad. You know, I've kind of refreshed myself, you know, and I don't have to be there forever. I can just go there and what have you. And the reason why I told you to stick to the H.H. Richardson of where I grew up, Lawrence was founded by abolitionists. So there were people, it's called Lawrence because people from Massachusetts, i.e. Lawrence, Massachusetts, came to Kansas to establish Lawrence to be a free state. And so there's buildings in Lawrence, Kansas that are mimicked after buildings from my hometown. So it was hard not to fall in love with this, right? To fall in love with this blue dot in a red state and feel like this was going to be amazing. And then I went to my first basketball game. And I'm sitting there with my cousin, and this guy looks over at me and he says, you must be related to one of them down there, talking about the athletes playing the basketball. And I'm like, we haven't spoken this whole game, and this is what you're going to say to me. So I pause, I look around, and everybody in the stands is predominantly white, right? I look at the ticket's $150. And I said, how on earth and I'm sitting in the rafters. So I wasn't, even though I worked in athletics, I wasn't sitting on courtside. I was sitting maybe 5 to 6 benches from the top. So I said, how on earth can you have this ticket that expensive to support African Americans and make it so that people of lower socioeconomic status can't even come to this game? And then it just started again, right? Everything I experienced in Nebraska and Missouri, it started again. The interesting thing was that I learned about the border war. So if you guys don't know about the border war, when Missouri and Kansas used to be in the same conference in athletics, when they would play against each other, they called it the border war. Now, when I was at Mizzou, I didn't think anything about it because Mizzou sports weren't very good. So I never thought anything about what the border war meant or anything like that. And they never talked about it. I wasn't an undergrad. I wasn't involved in athletics like that. So I never really got the understanding of it. At KU, as part of their indoctrination of the freshman athletes when they come in, they show them this story of what the border war was really about. And the border war was about the fight between Missouri and Kansas over Kansas being a free state and the atrocities that happened as a result of that. And so in some ways, they're like, you're on the right side of wrong, right? You're in KU. We were on the right side of history at that point. But the thing is that although you might have been on the right side of history, they never stopped to really think of how are you still growing and understanding what that history has still trickle down effect has had on your current athletes. And at the time that I was at KU is when the Missouri football team protested because there was a graduate student who was starving himself in protest of the racial inequalities and the racial experiences and the institutionalized racism that was happening at Mizzou. The stuff that I experienced, right? A faculty member saying to me, well, is it really that bad that, you're Black and that things aren't going your way here, right? So when that happened, the conversation about race finally started in the athletic department. And it was so obvious how oblivious a lot of these faculty and staff members were of what our athletes were actually experiencing and how angry they were and how isolated they felt. So although you might have been on the right side of wrong in history, you're still on the wrong side of wrong in current times. So that is probably the moment where, as a professional, I started to figure out how to put all of this stuff together, right? So I grew up in a very kind of subtle racist environment, very mixed messages, but very understanding of culture. And then I went through this whole entire racial burnout. But now at that point, I was a licensed psychologist. Now at that point, I had to start to understand how I can navigate this as a professional and be a place where people feel safe and where I can advocate and where I can make some change, right? And as a therapist, when you're listening to people, you're not only navigating your own racial development, right, at that time, but you're listening to people navigate their own racial development. You're listening to people navigate these social issues, the issues that they experience at home. And the crux of it is being in a predominantly white area, I also had to listen to people who were not on the same plane as me, who were coming in and they didn't necessarily agree with someone who had views that I agreed with, right? But you're a therapist and your role is to take your bias out of it and be able to sit with this person in their struggles and help them grow in a way that's gonna benefit and align with their goals, right? And so you've got to start to look at the world and how you experience the world differently. And this is where I started to pull back from my anger and started to look at things with more of a compassionate lens. So to sum up kind of all of this in terms of how that's defined me as a professional, there's a couple things. One is that I really started to see people as people, right? So I went from like kind of oblivious to really being angry and understanding that like, wow, like these people exist in a certain way. But I started to see people as people at the very basis of it and understand that some of the issues I was experiencing in the Midwest was because that area is void of culture, right? They don't have their own cultural understanding. They don't have something to ground themselves in. So therefore, how would they understand someone else's cultural experience, right? If we talk about diversity and cultural competency, the main things we always talk about is awareness, knowledge, and skills. I emphasize awareness as self-awareness. You have to be self-aware of yourself as a cultural being in order to navigate and be able to take in knowledge of other people's cultures. These areas are void of culture, and they're void of that education of other cultures. So where I was expecting them to have skills and to be able to help me in the ways that I wanted them to help me when I was struggling, they couldn't, because they didn't have those first two things that they needed, right? But also, I needed to be able to sit back and listen to other people's cultural experience. My experience defined who I am, but everybody's experience is not the same. And so I had to learn how to take that lens off and be able to listen to other people's stories. Even if you look like me, what you experience doesn't necessarily say that we are the same, right? We didn't experience the same thing. So we can look like each other, but we may not see things the same way. And at the end of the day, in terms of people as people, we all want to succeed in this life, but we're under this false narrative that there's limited resources in doing that. And so when I learned how to have these conversations as a therapist with someone who holds some of these biases, we work a little bit more in terms of seeing that that's a false narrative, that you can't do these things, that it is possible for you to do these things, and what that would look like. How can we still all get to that same goal and move away from the idea that we have to compete with each other in order to get there? The second thing in terms of what all of this really taught me is how important self-care is. How important it was for me to let go of my anger, because my anger was hurting me. It was hurting me in the sense that physically and emotionally it was harmful, but it was also hurting me and being able to really move forward in understanding and developing relationships with people. I learned how to empower myself, right? To see that I could still protest and I could still advocate and I could still be an active change, and I can do all of those things and not feel like I had to be angry every day about it, like, because it wasn't helpful. So there's things that I say to people in terms of like, you know, I don't bank with big banks. You know, I bank with credit unions because they give back to the community. And the credit union I bank with is the one I joined in Atlanta because I know that they are benefiting a predominantly Black city. So for me, I feel like I'm acting change and I'm advocating in those ways. Third, I would say the willingness to learn from whoever is willing to teach. So I'm going to go back to, and I think I reiterated a couple times that my father always said, you know, treat people with the golden rule. Treat them with respect. If they respect you back, great. And so I never felt like I needed to learn only from someone who looked like me. I always allowed myself to learn from whoever was willing to give me some information that was going to benefit me, right? Even if you didn't like me or whatever, that didn't matter. If you won't give me something that was going to help me grow, then I was willing to listen. Because even though you may not understand all of my experiences, you will understand some and enough to help me further myself. And then on top of that is understanding that, you know, that point of being compassionate. And I hear it a lot in terms of, especially now with racial burnout. And I get it because I was there, where there's that sense of like, I don't want to have to teach you. I don't want to have to be the teacher. I'm always the only Black kid in school, and I don't want to have to be the one who's always saying something and always teaching you and what have you. And I think once I let go of my anger, I stopped feeling that way. And there's reasons why I stopped feeling that way. And I'm going to go back to the statement I said at the beginning, that it's a privilege to learn about racism rather than experience it your whole life. Right. So there are things that I learned from other people and them teaching me that I wouldn't have experienced, like financial decisions. Now, I don't know about you, but my parents were like, you know, when the bill collectors called, they were like, say we not home. I'm like, but I'm 5. I don't really think I'm not supposed to be home by myself. Right. So if I'm looking at it from a diversity situation, I can't say to someone who has grown up void of culture, void of experience, go figure it out. They don't know where to start. Same way I didn't know where to start when it came to financial literacy. So their experiences are not going to teach them that. Someone has to help them understand. And I'm okay with taking that on. And I'm not saying everybody has to, but I'm okay with taking that on because I can be compassionate and understanding of what it's like to not know something and what it's like to feel like you're navigating that by yourself, because there's things that I did that I didn't know that someone taught me. So I'm okay with teaching them. So to sum it up, you know, being a therapist and being someone who had all the experience I've had, you know, like I said, I've come down to understanding that people are people. Self-care is important. I'm going to be willing and open to have a conversation with anybody as long as it's going to enhance me in some way. And I'm willing to help and teach with people who don't know and are willing to learn to grow themselves. So that's my story in, you know, I would say a nutshell, but that probably was a really long-winded way to get to some point. So if you have any questions or comments or anything, I would be glad to hear them.